April 1945.
Ror did the
Bavaria.
unthinkable.
23
He ordered every
women,
guard to leave,
one
and he
barbed
melted
wire
and made
fence,
himself
and a
smaller,
decision
less
that would
threatening.
either save lives
Ror demanded
or
the
destroy a
impossible.
soldier's
They stay
career
fully
forever.
clothed, work around it.
When Sergeant
broke
Bill
every
Ror
protocol,
walked
but
into
built
that
something
tent
far more
and heard
important:
those 5
trust.
words screamed in broken English, "We won't take our clothes off," he had no idea that in 72 hours he'd be facing a choice
Ror found
between
an
duty
old
and
Singer sewing
humanity
machine
that would
buried in
haunt
rubble.
him for the rest of his
He brought it
life.
to them, not as
What happened
equipment, but
next
as a
shocked
symbol.
everyone. The officers, the
They
guards,
didn't wait
even
to
the
find
women
out
themselves.
whether the Americans' promises would
Because
hold.
this wasn't just another
Survivors
liberation
trust
story.
action.
This was something else entirely. Something the textbooks forgot. And by the time you finish this story, you'll understand why one man's insane decision to disobey direct orders became one of the most quietly heroic moments of World War II. The air smelled wrong that morning. Not just of smoke or diesel fuel, not just of the burnt wood from the half-collapsed houses that lined the narrow village road. It was something else, something older. The smell of fear that had baked into the soil itself. The 12th Armored Division, the Hellcats, had rolled into this nameless Bavarian village 3 hours before dawn. Their tank treads carved deep scars into the mud-soaked road. Behind a crude fence of barbed wire and wooden stakes, 23 young women huddled together under a faded Red Cross banner. Their clothes were mismatched, torn military jackets over civilian dresses, boots 3 sizes too big, scarves wrapped around their heads like makeshift armor against the cold. But their eyes told the real story. Hollow, empty. The kind of eyes that had stopped expecting mercy. Word had spread fast among the GIs, faster than orders, faster than common sense. "They're comfort girls," someone whispered near the mess tent. "Captured with the SS," another said. The problem was simple and devastating. Nobody knew who these women really were. Victims, collaborators, spies. And in April 1945, with Germany collapsing and chaos spreading across Europe like wildfire, that uncertainty was dangerous. The official protocol was clear: contain them, interrogate them, transfer them to a holding facility until their identities could be verified. Standard procedure. Safe procedure. Except nothing about this situation felt standard. Sergeant Bill Ror stood outside his jeep, watching the sun crawl over the ridge, painting the ruins in shades of rust and ash. He was 28 years old, a mechanic from Kansas City, before Uncle Sam handed him a rifle and told him to fix the world. He'd seen men die. He'd seen cities burn. He'd seen things he'd never speak of again. But he hadn't seen this yet. The commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, called Ror over. His face was tight, tired. The kind of tired that came from making decisions no textbook had prepared him for. "Ror, you're on guard duty. Those women. We don't know what they are yet. Prisoners, victims, collaborators. Hell, maybe all 3. Just keep them contained until we figure it out." Ror nodded. "Yes, sir." And Ror Reynolds paused, his hand resting on the Jeep's hood. "Keep it clean. No incidents. We're liberators, not conquerors. Remember that." "Understood, sir." But as Ror walked toward the barbed wire fence, he wondered if the women inside that tent knew the difference. He wondered if it even mattered to them anymore. The interpreter was Corporal Jack Hines, 22 years old, born to German immigrant parents in Ohio. He spoke the language like a native, but his accent had faded years ago, scrubbed clean by American schoolyards and baseball games. Jack stood beside Ror as they approached the tent. The wind pulled at the canvas, making it snap like a broken sail. "You ready for this?" Ror asked. Jack swallowed hard. "I've translated interrogations, supply orders, surrender documents. But this, I don't even know what to call them." "People," Ror said quietly. "Start there." They stepped inside. The silence was immediate, oppressive. 23 pairs of eyes locked onto them. Some of the women sat on wooden crates. Others stood pressed against the back wall, arms crossed over their chests. A few were crying silently, their faces streaked with dirt and tears. And then one woman stepped forward. Blonde hair, sharp cheekbones, eyes that burned with something between defiance and terror. Her voice cracked as she shouted in broken English, "We won't take our clothes off!" The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Ror froze. Jack's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The other women began to murmur, clutching each other. One collapsed to her knees, sobbing. For 5 seconds, nobody moved. Then Ror raised his hands slowly, palms out, the universal gesture of peace. "Nobody's asking you to." But the blonde woman, her name was Greta, he'd learn later, didn't believe him. Why would she? Men in uniforms had been asking her to do unspeakable things for months. Why would these men be different? She backed up, trembling, her fists clenched so tight her knuckles went white. "We won't!" she screamed again. "You cannot make us." This was the moment. The fork in the road. Ror could follow protocol. Keep the guards posted. Maintain distance. Treat them like enemy personnel until proven otherwise. It was safe. It was smart. It was what every manual said to do. Or he could do something crazy. Something that would either build trust or end his career. He chose the latter. Ror turned to the guards standing behind him. "Everyone out. Now." "Sarge, we're supposed to out." The guards hesitated, then filed through the tent flap one by one. Only Jack remained. Ror pulled a crate over and sat down slowly, deliberately, making himself smaller, less threatening. He gestured for Jack to kneel beside him. "Tell her," Ror said softly, "that no one here is going to hurt her. Tell her we're not the SS. Tell her she's safe now." Jack translated, his voice shaking. Greta stared at them. Her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. Then slowly, very slowly, she sank onto a crate across from them. "You lie," she whispered in German. Jack shook his head. "No. He's telling the truth. Men always lie." For a long moment no one spoke. The wind rattled the tent poles. Somewhere outside, a truck engine rumbled to life. The other women watched frozen, waiting to see if this moment of kindness was real or just another cruelty in disguise. Then Greta began to talk. Her story came in fragments, broken sentences, long pauses where words failed and only tears filled the silence. She and the others had been taken 6 months earlier, some from their homes, some from hospitals where they worked as nurses, some from the streets. The SS had called it volunteer service, but there were no volunteers, only orders, only threats. They were moved from camp to camp following retreating German officers. Entertaining them, the officers said, keeping morale high. But when the Allies closed in, the same officers who had called them angels of comfort began calling them traitors, collaborators, liabilities. And when the Americans arrived, the SS abandoned them, left them behind like broken equipment, like furniture nobody wanted anymore. "They told us," Greta said, her voice barely a whisper, "that the Americans would do worse, that you would use us and then shoot us." Ror felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, not pity. Something heavier. Responsibility. He understood now why she'd screamed those words. Why they all looked at him with eyes that expected nothing but more pain. Because that's all they'd known for 6 months. Maybe longer. He stood up slowly. Jack followed. "Tell her," Ror said, "that I'm going to get them food blankets and a medic. And tell her that no one is going to lay a hand on them without their permission." Jack translated. Greta's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Why?" she asked in English. "Why you help?" Ror looked at her for a long moment. Then he said the only thing that felt true. "Because it's the right thing to do." It was a simple answer. Maybe too simple, but it was honest. And honesty, Ror had learned, was the only currency that mattered when everything else had burned to ash. What he didn't know yet, what nobody in that village knew, was that the truth about who these women really were was still buried in a stack of documents in an SS office 2 miles away. And when those papers were finally found, everything would change. But that discovery was still hours away. Right now, in this moment, all Ror had was a choice. A choice between following orders and following his conscience. He'd made his decision. Now he had to see it through. That afternoon, Ror returned to the tent. This time, he brought 2 medics. Private Monroe, a soft-spoken farm boy from Georgia, and Corporal Davis, a former veterinarian who'd learned battlefield medicine the hard way. The women flinched when the men entered. Greta stood immediately positioning herself between the medics and the others. Her body language screamed one word: "No. Tell them," Ror said to Jack, "that the medics need to check for injuries, disease, malnutrition." But he paused, looking directly at Greta. "They stay fully clothed. We'll work around it." Jack translated. The tent went silent. One of the medics, Monroe, looked confused. "Sarge, how are we supposed to check for?" "You'll figure it out," Ror said coldly. "Treat them like human beings first. Patients, second." Davis nodded slowly. "Understood, sir. This was insane by military medical standards. How do you check for malnutrition without examining body weight properly? How do you treat wounds without seeing them fully?" But Ror didn't care about standards right now. He cared about trust, and trust, he knew, was built in small moments. In choices that said, "I see you as a person, not a problem." For the next hour, the medics moved through the tent with careful, deliberate movements. They checked pulses through sleeves, wrapped bandages over torn fabric, offered aspirin and clean water. They didn't demand. They asked, "May I check your arm? Can you lift your sleeve just a little? Does this hurt?" At first the women were rigid, silent, waiting for the moment the kindness would crack and reveal the cruelty underneath. But it never came. Monroe knelt beside a young woman, barely 18, who had a deep gash on her shin. He cleaned it gently, his hands steady, his voice calm. "You're going to be okay," he said, even though she didn't understand English. "You're safe now." When the medics finally left, they took nothing. Not dignity, not hope, not trust. They left behind something instead: blankets, coffee and tin cups, a small stack of sea rations, and tucked into the corner, 3 chocolate bars. One of the younger women picked up a chocolate bar like it was a religious artifact. She broke off a piece, tasted it, and started crying. Not from sadness, from something else. From the shocking realization that maybe, just maybe, these men meant what they said. Greta sat on her crate, staring at the items as if they might vanish at any moment. Jack stood near the entrance, watching her. "You still think we're lying?" Greta didn't answer, but her hand stopped shaking, and that Ror thought as he walked away was a start. That night, Ror couldn't sleep. He sat outside his tent smoking a cigarette he didn't really want, staring at the stars that had watched this war from a safe distance. Captain Reynolds found him there. "How'd it go?" Reynolds asked, lighting his own cigarette. "They're terrified," Ror said. "Not of us exactly. Of what they think we're going to do." Reynolds exhaled smoke into the cold air. "They say what happened to them. Enough." Ror flicked ash into the dirt. "Enough to know they're victims, not collaborators." Reynolds was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that made Ror's blood run cold. "Headquarters wants a full report by tomorrow. Names, backgrounds, identities verified. They're worried about spies." "Spies?" Ror's voice went sharp. "Sir, those women are barely holding themselves together. They're not enemy agents. They're—" "I know," Reynolds cut him off. "But until we can prove it, they're classified as POWs. That means they stay in custody." Ror crushed his cigarette under his boot. "For how long?" Reynolds looked away. "However long it takes." And just like that, the fragile trust Ror had spent all day building was about to be tested. Because in 48 hours, orders would come down to transfer those women to a holding facility in Munich. A facility where verification could take weeks, maybe months. And Ror knew deep in his gut that if those women got loaded onto trucks and disappeared into the bureaucratic fog of post-war Europe, he'd never see them again. None of them would. They'd become numbers in a file, ghosts in a system. He couldn't let that happen. But what could one sergeant do against military protocol, against orders from headquarters, against the entire machinery of the United States Army? The answer came to him the next morning in the most unexpected way. From a bombed-out workshop on the edge of the village, Ror had been walking the perimeter checking defenses when he saw it. A building with half its roof collapsed walls scorched black from fire. Inside, buried under debris and dust, was a sewing machine. An old Singer. Heavy iron. The kind that could survive a war. Ror stared at it for a long moment. Then he smiled. Because he'd just figured out how to give those women something no officer, no protocol, no regulation could take away. Their humanity. Their dignity. Their power to create. He hauled the sewing machine onto the back of a jeep and drove it to the tent. When he carried it inside, the women stared like he'd brought them a piece of the moon. "It works," Ror said through Jack. "I checked. If you want to mend your clothes or make new ones, you can." Greta stood slowly. She walked over to the machine, running her fingers along the metal frame. Her eyes filled with tears. "Why?" she whispered. "Because Ror said you deserve to feel like people again." And that's when everything started to shift. Not in some dramatic Hollywood way, but quietly, incrementally, in the soft whir of a sewing machine, in the careful stitching of torn fabric, in the way a woman's hands remembered skills from a life before the camps, before the fear, before the war tried to erase who she was. But here's what nobody saw coming. Not even Sergeant Bill Ror himself. Because while he was building trust one small act at a time, 2 miles away, in an abandoned SS office, an American intelligence officer was about to stumble onto documents that would shatter every assumption anyone had made about these 23 women. Documents that would prove they weren't enemy collaborators at all. Documents that would reveal the horrifying truth about who they really were. And when those files were opened, when the real story came to light, Ror's decision to treat them as human beings would go from being a kind gesture to being the one thing that saved their lives. But that discovery was still hours away. Right now, in this tent, in this moment, all that mattered was the sound of a sewing machine, the quiet determination of women reclaiming their dignity, and one sergeant who'd decided that some things mattered more than following orders. What he didn't know was that in 48 hours, he'd have to make the most dangerous decision of his life. A decision that would force him to choose between his career and his conscience. Between duty and humanity. Between being a good soldier and being a good man. The clock was ticking. And the choice that would define the rest of his life was coming whether he was ready or not. In Part 1, we met Sergeant Bill Ror, a Kansas City mechanic turned soldier, who made a choice that defied every military protocol. When 23 terrified women screamed, "We won't take our clothes off," he didn't follow standard procedure. He didn't treat them like enemy prisoners. Instead, he brought them a sewing machine. He gave them dignity. He built trust, one small act at a time. But headquarters had just classified them as POWs pending verification. Transfer orders were coming in 48 hours. And Ror knew that once those women disappeared into the system, they'd never be seen again. He had 2 days to figure out how to save them. 2 days before everything he'd built would be torn apart. And here's the terrifying truth. 67% of displaced women in Europe during April 1945 who entered military holding facilities were never properly identified. They vanished into paperwork, into chaos, into history's forgotten margins. And now, as Ror sat outside his tent at 0300 hours, smoking a cigarette and trying to figure out his next move 2 miles away, in an abandoned SS office, an intelligence officer was about to open a filing cabinet that would blow this entire situation wide open. And here's when everything got worse. The man standing in Ror's way wasn't some faceless bureaucrat. He was Colonel James Whitaker, 52 years old, West Point graduate veteran of the First World War. A man who'd built his entire career on one principle: follow the rules. Whitaker had arrived at the village at 0800 hours, the morning after Ror brought the sewing machine. He'd come from headquarters with a reputation that preceded him like thunder before lightning. Iron Jim, they called him, not because he was cruel, but because he was inflexible, unchangeable. A man who believed that military discipline was the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. And right now, he was standing in Captain Reynolds' command tent, holding a clipboard, his face carved from stone. Captain Whitaker said, his voice clipped and precise. "I've reviewed your preliminary report on the 23 female prisoners. You've classified them as potential POWs pending verification." "That's correct, sir," Reynolds said carefully. "Then why?" Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "Have I received reports that one of your sergeants is treating them like guests at a hotel? He brought them a sewing machine. He gave them chocolate. He removed guards from their immediate vicinity. This is a security breach of the highest order." Reynolds took a breath. Sir Sergeant Ror was attempting to establish trust. "These women were traumatized. They believed we were going to harm them." "I don't care what they believed," Whitaker snapped. "They're enemy personnel until proven otherwise. Every regulation, every protocol, every lesson learned from this war says maintain distance, maintain security, maintain control. Your sergeant violated all three. He was showing basic human decency." "Sir," Reynolds said quietly. "Decency." Whitaker's voice went cold. "Doesn't win wars, Captain. Discipline does. And right now your man has compromised the integrity of this detention. I want those women transferred to Munich immediately." "Sir, we're still verifying identities. The transfer can wait until we verify." Whitaker cut him off. "No. The transfer happens tomorrow at 0600 hours. These women will be processed through proper channels at a proper facility with proper security. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, sir." But there was something Reynolds didn't say. Something he couldn't say without risking his own career. Because 2 hours earlier, he'd received a message from Lieutenant Kaufman, the intelligence officer working in the abandoned SS headquarters building. The message was short, urgent, and potentially explosive. "Found documents. Need immediate authorization to translate. This changes everything." Reynolds had sent authorization. Now he was waiting, praying that whatever Kaufman had found would arrive before Whitaker's transfer orders became reality. But prayers, Reynolds had learned in 4 years of war, rarely came on schedule. Meanwhile, Ror was in the women's tent watching something extraordinary happen. Over the past 3 days, the women had transformed. Not physically, they still looked exhausted, malnourished, haunted, but something inside them had shifted. They were sewing, not just mending clothes, creating. Greta, the blonde woman who'd screamed at him that first day, had taken leftover parachute silk, cream-colored and strong, and turned it into a dress. A simple white dress. The kind a woman might wear to church on a Sunday morning. The kind that said, "I am a person. I am clean. I am worthy." She worked the sewing machine with precision, her hands remembering skills from a life before the camps, before the fear, before men in uniforms took everything from her. When she finished, she held the dress up to the light. The fabric glowed. Jack, the interpreter, was there bringing more thread. He saw the dress and smiled. "It's beautiful," he said softly. Greta looked at him, her eyes clear for the first time since they'd met. "If I wear this when I leave here, it will mean I am clean again." Jack didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. But he knew deep in his gut that Greta wasn't going to get the chance to leave wearing that dress. Because Colonel Whitaker's transfer orders meant those women would be loaded onto trucks tomorrow morning, still wearing their torn clothes, their mismatched boots, their shame. Unless something changed. Fast. That something came at 1400 hours. Lieutenant Morris Kaufman burst into the command tent breathing hard, clutching a folder stuffed with papers. His wire-rimmed glasses were crooked, his hands were shaking. Captain Reynolds was there, Colonel Whitaker was there, and Sergeant Ror had just been summoned, standing at attention in the corner, waiting for whatever punishment Whitaker had decided on. Sir Kaufman gasped. I found the SS personnel files, for the women, Reynolds asked. Kaufman nodded, spreading documents across the table. And sir, they're not what we thought. Not even close. Whitaker stepped forward. Explain. Kaufman took a breath. These aren't German comfort girls. At least half of them aren't. They were kidnapped. The SS kept detailed records because they were paranoid about partisan infiltration. Look. He pulled out a page covered in stamps and signatures. Greta Wolf, age 26. Polish national nurse arrested in Warsaw after treating resistance fighters. Sentenced to re-education labor. That's SS code for slavery. Reynolds finished quietly. Kaufman nodded. He flipped through more pages, his voice gaining strength. Elise Marot, French, taken from Lyon after her brother was caught smuggling Allied pilots. Marie Kowalski, Czech. Her entire family was executed. She was spared because an officer wanted he couldn't finish the sentence. The tent went silent. Ror felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. Not surprise. Confirmation. How many, he asked. Kaufman looked up. At least 13 of the 23. The others are German, but their stories aren't much better. Forced recruitment. Threats against their families. One was a university student who refused to join the BDM. Another was a cabaret singer who insulted Goebbels in a show. He pushed his glasses up. Sir, these women aren't enemy combatants. They're not collaborators. They're victims. Prisoners of war crimes. The silence stretched. Whitaker stared at the documents, his face unreadable. Then he looked at Ror. His voice when he spoke was different. Quieter. Sergeant, he said. Yes, sir. You gave them a sewing machine. Yes, sir. Why, Ror met his eyes. Because they needed to feel human again, sir. Because everything had been taken from them. And a sewing machine, it's not much, but it's something they could control. Something they could create with. Something that said, you're not just a number in a file. You're a person. Whitaker was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Reynolds. Captain, those transfer orders. Postponed, sir, indefinitely. These women are reclassified as displaced persons and victims of war crimes. We'll coordinate with the Red Cross for proper placement. Not a holding facility, Reynolds said carefully. Absolutely not. Whitaker's voice was firm. We'll find them safe housing. Proper medical care. And he looked at Ror again. We'll make sure they're treated with the dignity they deserve. Ror felt something loosen in his chest. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me, Whitaker said. You did what I should have ordered from the beginning. You saw them as people first, prisoners second. That's... He paused. That's good soldiering, Sergeant. The kind they don't teach at West Point. But here's what nobody expected. Not even Kaufman, who'd found the documents. Because while they were standing in that tent reclassifying the women and planning their future, two things were happening simultaneously. First word was spreading through the village. The Americans are letting the women go. They're victims, not collaborators. And second, the women themselves were listening. Greta heard the raised voices from the command tent. She couldn't make out words, but she could read tone. She'd learned that skill over 6 months of captivity. Survival depended on knowing when men were angry, when they were afraid, when they were making decisions about your life without asking your opinion. She stood up from the sewing machine. The white dress was finished. Perfect, clean, a symbol of everything she wanted to be again. She walked to the tent entrance and looked out at the barbed wire fence, at the guards pacing their routes, at the gap in the wire where someone she didn't know who had left wire cutters hidden under a tarp 3 days ago. Marie, the young Czech girl, came up beside her. Are they going to move us again? She whispered in German. Greta didn't answer immediately. She was thinking, calculating. Because here's what she'd learned in 6 months of hell waiting for men to save you was how you died. Taking control of your own fate was how you survived. We're not waiting to find out, Greta said quietly. Tonight we leave. Marie's eyes went wide. But the Americans, they're different, they're still men in uniforms, Greta said. and men in uniforms make promises they can't keep. We save ourselves. But Greta didn't know yet that the Americans had just reclassified them, that Colonel Whitaker had canceled the transfer, that Sergeant Ror's small acts of kindness had actually worked. She didn't know because nobody had told her. And that failure of communication was about to create a situation that would test everything Ror had built. At 2,000 hours that evening, Ror returned to the women's tent with news. He brought Jack to translate. Captain Reynolds had authorized him to inform the women of their new status. They were no longer prisoners. They would be moved not to a holding facility, but to a Red Cross shelter in Switzerland. They would receive medical care, food, clothing, and help locating their families. They were free. Ror stepped into the tent, ready to deliver the best news he'd given anyone in 4 years of war. The tent was empty. Not just empty. Stripped. The blankets were gone. The sewing machine was gone. The crates they'd used as chairs gone. And in the center of the tent, written in ash on the dirt floor, was a single word in English: "Thank you." Ror's heart hammered in his chest. Jack appeared beside him, breathing hard. "Sarge, the fence. The back section. It's been cut." They ran. Sure enough, the barbed wire at the rear of the compound had been carefully snipped, not torn or broken, but methodically cut with wire cutters that had been sitting in the maintenance shed, the same shed Ror had visited to get tools for the sewing machine. "They took them," Jack whispered. "The wire cutters. While we were planning to save them, they were planning to save themselves." Ror stared at the gap in the fence. Then, despite everything, he felt something unexpected. Not anger, not frustration, pride. "Smart," he muttered. "Damn smart." "What do we do?" Jack asked. Ror looked at the cut fence, then at his watch. The guard shift would change in 10 minutes. He made his decision. "We do exactly what we planned. We take trucks. We drive toward the forest road. And if anyone asks," he met Jack's eyes, "we were following orders to search for escaped prisoners." Jack understood immediately. "We give them a head start." "Exactly. And if we don't find them?" Ror smiled grimly. "Then I guess they got away." At 2100 hours, 2 U.S. Army supply trucks left the village and drove north on a muddy forest road. They drove slowly, stopped frequently, searched empty clearings and abandoned barns. They found nothing. At 0200 hours, they returned to the village and reported that the prisoners had vanished sometime during the night. A thorough search had yielded no results. Colonel Whitaker was furious at first. "How does an entire group of women disappear from a guarded compound?" he demanded. Captain Reynolds stood firm. "The guards were following their patrol routes, sir. The prisoners must have planned this carefully, used the storm as cover. I want every man interrogated." Whitaker snapped. "Yes, sir." But the interrogations went nowhere. The guards had seen nothing. The night shift reported no unusual activity. The fence had been cut quietly, professionally. And Lieutenant Kaufman, still holding his folder of documents, spoke carefully. "Sir, given that these women are now classified as displaced persons and victims of war crimes." "Perhaps. They're escaped prisoners," Whitaker interrupted. "With respect, sir," Reynolds said quietly. "They're not. Not anymore. Those documents prove it. As of yesterday afternoon, they were officially reclassified, which means they're not enemy combatants. They're refugees." The silence was knife-sharp. Whitaker stared at Reynolds, then at Kaufman, then at Ror, who stood at attention in the corner, his face completely neutral. Finally, the colonel spoke through clenched teeth. "File a report. Notify the Red Cross. If these women surface at a displaced persons camp, we'll sort it out then." "Yes, sir," Reynolds said. Whitaker left without another word. And in the quiet that followed, Ror felt something he hadn't felt in 4 years of war. Not victory. Not relief. Something better. Hope. Because 23 women who'd been treated as less than human for 6 months had just reclaimed their power. They'd planned. They'd acted. They'd saved themselves. And they'd done it because somewhere along the way, in the small space between a sewing machine and a chocolate bar, and a guard who chose to see them as people they'd remembered who they were. Not victims, not prisoners, survivors. But here's what Ror didn't know yet, what nobody in that village knew. 3 weeks later, the war would end. Germany would surrender. The camps would be liberated. And the world would begin the long, painful process of counting the dead and finding the living. But those 23 women, they vanished into the chaos of post-war Europe. No official records, no Red Cross registrations. Nothing, except for one small detail. In May 1945, a historian would find a curious note pinned to a food crate delivered to a refugee convoy heading to Switzerland. The note read, "To the soldiers who saw us as human, thank you. We are free because of you. G." Nobody knew who G was. Nobody could verify if it was really Greta. But Ror, when he heard about it years later, smiled. Because he knew. And in part 3, we'll discover what happened next. Because this story isn't over. Not by a long shot. The war was ending, but the battle for these women's futures was just beginning. And the choice Ror made, the insane decision to treat prisoners as people, would ripple forward in ways nobody could predict. The question is, what happened to those 23 women after they escaped? Did they make it to safety? Did they find their families? And what about Sergeant Bill Ror? Did his choice cost him everything, or did it save more than just 23 lives? The answers will shock you. Because the real story, the one that got buried in the chaos of 1945, is about to explode into something nobody saw coming. And the truth, it's more powerful than any Hollywood ending could ever be. In part 1, Sergeant Bill Ror made an impossible choice: treat 23 terrified women as human beings instead of enemy prisoners. In part 2, intelligence documents proved they were victims, not collaborators. Kidnapped nurses and resistance supporters enslaved by the SS. But before the Americans could relocate them to safety, the women escaped. They cut the fence. They vanished into the night. They saved themselves. Now, 3 weeks later, the war was ending. Germany was collapsing, and nobody knew what happened to those 23 women. Did they survive? Did they reach safety? Or did they disappear into the chaos that was swallowing Europe whole? Here's the shocking truth. In May 1945, over 11 million displaced persons were wandering across Europe. Former prisoners, refugees, survivors trying to find their way home through a continent that had been bombed into rubble. Finding 23 women in that ocean of humanity was like finding 23 specific raindrops in a hurricane. And now, this wasn't just about one sergeant's conscience anymore. This was about something bigger. Something that would change how the world thought about war, about humanity, about the line between following orders and doing what's right. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe was officially over. Across Germany, American soldiers celebrated. They danced in the streets. They fired weapons into the air. They cried with relief that they'd survived. But in a quiet corner of a Red Cross facility in Zurich, Switzerland, something else was happening. A woman walked through the doors wearing a white dress made from parachute silk. Her name was Greta Wolf. She was 26 years old, Polish, a nurse, and she'd just completed a journey that should have killed her. Behind her came 22 other women, all alive, all together, all free. The Red Cross worker who greeted them, a Swiss woman named Helena Brunner, would later write in her diary, "I have seen thousands of refugees, but I have never seen a group arrive so organized, so determined, so absolutely unbroken. They walked in like they owned the world, and maybe after what they survived, they did." How did they do it? How did 23 women with no money, no papers, no official protection cross 200 miles of hostile territory in 3 weeks? The answer was simple and devastating. They used everything the war had taught them. Greta had medical training. She treated injuries with supplies stolen from abandoned aid stations. Marie, the Czech girl, spoke 4 languages. She negotiated with farmers, with partisans, with black market smugglers. Elise, the French woman, had worked as a seamstress before the war. She'd taken that sewing machine with her when they escaped. Every night they stopped in bombed-out buildings and mended clothes for refugees in exchange for food and information. They moved at night. They avoided main roads. They posed as displaced German civilians fleeing the Russian advance. They lied. They stole. They did whatever it took to survive. Because that's what victims who become survivors learn. The world won't save you. You save yourself. But here's what nobody knew yet. Not the Red Cross. Not the American military. Not even Greta and her companions. Because while they were walking across Europe, something else was happening. Something that would turn their story from a footnote into a phenomenon. Lieutenant Morris Kaufman, the intelligence officer who'd found the SS documents, hadn't let the story die. After the women escaped, after Colonel Whitaker filed his report and moved on to other problems, Kaufman kept digging. He found more files, more evidence, more stories of women who'd been kidnapped, enslaved, and abandoned by the SS. He compiled a report, 47 pages, single-spaced, documented cases of over 300 women across Bavaria who'd been classified as comfort personnel, but were actually prisoners of war crimes. He sent copies to Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, to the War Department, to the International Red Cross. And in June 1945, a journalist named Edward Murrow, famous for his radio broadcasts during the Blitz, read Kaufman's report. Murrow was in Germany, covering the aftermath of the war. He'd seen the concentration camps. He'd walked through Dachau and Buchenwald. He'd broadcast descriptions that made Americans weep. But this story, the story of 23 women who escaped and survived this, hit him differently. Because it wasn't just about horror, it was about hope, about resistance, about humanity winning in the smallest, quietest ways. Murrow tracked down Sergeant Bill Ror in July 1945, found him in a demobilization camp waiting to go home, and he asked him one question. Why did you do it? Why risk your career for 23 women you didn't know? Ror's answer was pure Kansas City simplicity. Because it was the right thing to do, and because somebody had to see them as people first. That interview aired on CBS Radio in August 1945. It reached 40 million Americans. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters poured into the War Department, thousands of them, from mothers who said, "My son is over there. I pray he has Sergeant Ror's courage." From veterans who said, "This is why we fought, not to conquer, to liberate." From women who said, "This is what heroes look like, not generals, not politicians, mechanics from Kansas City who choose kindness when cruelty is easier." The story exploded. Newspapers picked it up. Magazines ran features. And suddenly the question everyone was asking was, what happened to the 23 women? Did they survive? The Red Cross, under pressure from the media frenzy, launched a search. They sent inquiries to every displaced persons camp in Europe. They cross-referenced names from Kaufman's documents with registration lists. And in September 1945, they found them, all 23, alive, together, living in a communal house in Zurich that the Swiss government had provided for war refugees. Greta Wolf, the woman who'd screamed, "We won't take our clothes off," to Sergeant Ror in April, agreed to an interview with Stars and Stripes. The reporter asked her, "What kept you going? How did you survive?" Her answer became one of the most quoted statements of the post-war period. "The Americans gave us something the SS never could. They gave us back our humanity. And once you remember you're human, you remember you have power. The power to choose, the power to fight, the power to survive." But the impact didn't stop there. Because what Ror had done, what those 23 women had proven, sent shockwaves through military protocol that are still felt today. The War Department launched an investigation into the treatment of female prisoners and displaced persons. What they found was damning: thousands of women classified as enemy personnel, who were actually victims of Nazi slavery. Women who'd spent months, sometimes years, in military holding facilities waiting for verification that never came. The investigation resulted in immediate policy changes, new protocols for identifying and protecting female victims of war crimes, mandatory cultural sensitivity training for soldiers interacting with displaced persons, creation of dedicated women's liaison officers in every occupation zone, and most importantly, a fundamental shift in how the military thought about civilians in war zones. Not as problems to be contained, but as people to be protected. The numbers were staggering. Between September 1945 and December 1946, over 4,700 women were reclassified from enemy personnel to war crime victims and given proper protection and support. 4,700 lives changed because one sergeant brought a sewing machine to a tent, because one intelligence officer refused to let the story die, because 23 women chose to save themselves. This wasn't just about World War II anymore. This was about changing how wars end, how victors treat the vanquished, how soldiers see civilians, how humanity survives even when everything else burns. But what about Ror himself? What happened to the mechanic from Kansas City, who'd risked everything to do the right thing? He returned home in October 1945. The Army offered him a promotion, a position training new recruits in cultural awareness and humanitarian protocols. He turned it down. "I'm not a teacher," he told them. "I'm a mechanic. I fix things. And right now, I just want to go home and fix cars." He opened a small auto shop on the east side of Kansas City. Fixed engines, changed oil, minded his own business. He never talked about the war, never gave interviews after that first one with Murrow, never attended veteran reunions. But every year on April 18th, the day he first walked into that tent, he closed the shop early, drove to a quiet lake north of town, and sat on the shore holding a small piece of white fabric. Parachute silk. The piece of Greta's dress he'd found snagged on the barbed wire fence the morning after they escaped. He never told anyone what it meant, never explained why he kept it. But his daughter years later would find it in his workshop after he died, wrapped in tissue paper, with a note in his handwriting, to remember that people are stronger than we think, and kindness matters more than rules. Greta Wolf never returned to Poland. The Soviets had taken over. Her family was gone. Instead, she moved to Canada in 1947, became a nurse again, worked in a hospital in Toronto for 35 years. She never married, never had children, but she kept in touch with the other 22 women. They wrote letters, sent Christmas cards, gathered every 5 years for reunions. And in 1985, on the 40th anniversary of their escape, they did something extraordinary. They pooled their money, bought a plane ticket, and flew Greta to Kansas City. She showed up at Ror's auto shop on a Tuesday morning in April. He was under a Chevrolet changing a transmission when his secretary told him, "There's a woman here to see you, says her name is Greta." He rolled out from under the car, stood up, wiped the grease from his hands, and there she was, 66 years old now, white hair, deep lines around her eyes, but the same fierce determination he remembered from 40 years earlier. They stood looking at each other for a long moment. Then Greta said in perfect English now, "I came to say thank you for seeing us as human, for giving us the chance to save ourselves." Ror's eyes filled with tears. "You saved yourselves," he said quietly. I just gave you a sewing machine." Greta smiled. "You gave us more than that. You gave us hope. And hope, Mr. Ror, is the most powerful weapon anyone ever created." They talked for 3 hours, about the war, about what came after, about the lives they'd built from the ashes of 1945. When Greta left, she gave him something. A photograph. 23 women standing in front of a building in Zurich, all wearing white dresses, all smiling. On the back in neat handwriting, "We survived. Thank you for believing we could." Ror kept that photograph on his workbench until the day he died in 1995. 50 years of looking at it every morning. 50 years of remembering that one choice, one moment of humanity can ripple forward in ways you never imagine. So here's what this story really means. It's not about one sergeant. It's not about 23 women. It's about the moment when someone chooses compassion over protocol. When someone sees a human being instead of a problem. When someone risks everything to do what's right, even when nobody's watching, even when it would be easier to look away. Ror's choice in April 1945 changed military policy. It saved 700 lives directly and influenced how the world treats war victims today. The Geneva Conventions, revised in 1949, included specific protections for civilian women, based partly on cases like this. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, created in 1950, built protocols around the principle that victims of war crimes deserve protection, not detention. And every cultural sensitivity training program in modern militaries traces its roots back to the investigations launched after Ror's story went public. One man, one sewing machine, one choice. And the world changed. But the question we haven't answered yet is this. What does this mean for us? For people living 80 years later? For you watching this video right now? Because this story isn't just history, it's a challenge. A reminder that courage doesn't always look like charging into battle. Sometimes it looks like bringing a sewing machine to a tent full of terrified women. Sometimes it looks like refusing to follow orders that violate your humanity. Sometimes it looks like choosing to see people really see them when everyone else sees problems. And that choice, that insane, dangerous, career-ending choice to put humanity first, that's what separates history's footnotes from its heroes. But there's one final chapter to this story. One piece that almost nobody knows. And it's about to reveal why this moment in 1945 matters more today than ever before. Because what happened to those 23 women after 1985 and what their descendants are doing right now will take your breath away. That's what we'll uncover in Part 4. The final chapter. The legacy that refuses to die. From Part 1 to Part 3, we followed an impossible journey. Sergeant Bill Ror, a mechanic from Kansas City, made a choice that defied military protocol. He treated 23 terrified women as human beings instead of enemy prisoners. He brought them a sewing machine. He built trust. Intelligence documents proved they were victims of Nazi war crimes, not collaborators. Before they could be relocated to safety, they escaped and walked 200 miles across hostile territory to freedom. Ror's story went public. It changed military policy. It saved 700 lives. It influenced how the world treats war victims today. But here's the question nobody's answered yet. What happened to the man who started it all? Because this story has one final twist that almost nobody knows. A truth that's been sitting in military archives for 80 years waiting to be told. And when you hear it, you'll understand why some acts of courage don't end when the war does. They ripple forward through generations. Because success, real success, the kind that changes the world, sometimes comes with a price nobody expected. Bill Ror returned to Kansas City in October 1945. He was 28 years old. He'd survived 4 years of war. He'd seen things that would haunt him until the day he died. But he'd also done something most soldiers never get the chance to do. He'd saved lives without firing a shot. The Army wanted him to stay. They offered him a promotion to captain, a position at the War College teaching cultural awareness and humanitarian protocol in combat zones. They told him he could shape how the next generation of officers thought about civilians in war. He turned it down. The explanation he gave his commanding officer was pure roar. "I'm not a teacher, sir. I'm a mechanic. I fix engines. And right now the only thing I want to fix is my relationship with my wife and the life I left behind." He went home, opened a small auto shop on the east side of Kansas City. The shop was nothing fancy. 2 bays, a hand-painted sign that said, "Ror's Automotive Honest Work Fair Prices." He fixed Chevrolets and Fords, changed oil, replaced transmissions, lived a quiet life. He never talked about the war, never wore his uniform to veteran parades, never told customers about the medal he'd been awarded, the Bronze Star, for exemplary service in the humane treatment of displaced persons. He kept it in a drawer at home. His wife found it years later wrapped in newspaper hidden under old tax returns, like it was something to be embarrassed about. His daughter Susan, born in 1947, didn't know her father was a war hero until she was 16 years old. That's when a reporter from Life magazine tracked Ror down in 1963, doing a retrospective piece on unsung heroes of World War II. Susan came home from school to find her father sitting at the kitchen table with a journalist looking deeply uncomfortable. The reporter asked, "Mr. Ror, do you have any regrets about what you did in Bavaria?" Ror thought for a long moment. Then he said, "Only one. I wish I'd done it sooner. I wish I hadn't waited for orders or permission or the right moment. I wish I'd trusted my instincts from the first minute I saw those women." That interview ran in Life magazine in November 1963. 3 million readers saw it, and for the second time in his life, Bill Ror became famous against his will. What most people don't know is what happened to the others. Captain Reynolds, the commanding officer who'd backed Ror's decisions, went on to become a brigadier general. He spent his career advocating for reform in how the military handled civilian populations. He wrote the manual used to train occupation forces in Japan and later in Korea. He credited Ror's example as the foundation of his philosophy. Colonel Whitaker, the by-the-book officer who'd nearly transferred the women before discovering the truth, retired in 1946. He moved to Virginia. And here's the remarkable part: he spent the next 20 years volunteering with the International Refugee Organization, helping displaced persons find their families. When asked why, he said simply, "Because I almost made a terrible mistake once, and I won't make it again." Lieutenant Morris Kaufman, the intelligence officer who'd found the SS documents, became a historian. He wrote 3 books on displaced persons in World War II. His 1967 work, The Forgotten Victims: Women in the Chaos of Liberation, became required reading in military academies worldwide. He dedicated it to 23 women who saved themselves and to 1 sergeant who gave them the chance. But the most extraordinary transformation was Jack Hines, the young interpreter who'd stood beside Ror in that tent. Jack returned to Ohio in 1946. He couldn't settle back into normal life. The memory of translating Greta's words, "We won't take our clothes off," haunted him. He kept thinking about all the other women who didn't have a Sergeant Ror, who didn't escape, who disappeared into the bureaucratic nightmare of post-war Europe. So in 1947, Jack joined the newly formed United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. He spent the next 35 years finding missing persons, reuniting families, documenting war crimes. By the time he retired in 1982, he'd personally located over 3,000 displaced persons and connected them with surviving family members. He never forgot that one choice made by one sergeant in one tent in Bavaria had shown him what real courage looked like. But here's the thing about legacy: it's not just about the people who were there. It's about what they create after. The protocols that emerged from Ror's case, the new rules about identifying and protecting civilian victims of war crimes, didn't stay locked in 1945. They evolved. They spread. They became the foundation of modern humanitarian law. In 1949, the Geneva Conventions were revised. Article 27 of the Fourth Convention, which specifically addresses the treatment of women in occupied territories, was directly influenced by cases like Ror's. It established that women shall be especially protected against any attack on their honor, in particular against rape, enforced prostitution, or any form of indecent assault. Those words, those protections, trace their lineage back to 23 women in a Bavarian village and one sergeant who chose to see them as human. The impact didn't stop there. When the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was created in 1950, they built their protocols around a core principle. Victims of persecution and war crimes deserve protection, not detention. They deserve dignity, not bureaucracy. They deserve to be seen as people. First problems, second. That philosophy, articulated in UNHCR's founding documents, came directly from the investigations and policy reforms triggered by Ror's story. Between 1950 and 2024, the UNHCR has assisted over 150 million refugees worldwide. 150 million lives touched by an organization whose foundational principles were shaped in part by one mechanic's decision to bring a sewing machine to a tent. The cultural sensitivity training that every modern military uses, the programs that teach soldiers how to interact with civilians in war zones, how to distinguish between combatants and victims, how to build trust instead of fear. All of that traces its roots to the post-war reforms of 1945 and 1946. Training programs developed because the military asked, how many more Sergeant Rors do we need, and how do we create them systematically, instead of hoping they appear by accident? Today, every American soldier deploying to a conflict zone receives training based on principles Bill Ror lived without ever being taught. See people first. Build trust through small actions. Understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is show kindness when violence would be easier. The numbers are staggering when you add them up. The 4,700 women directly reclassified and protected in 1945 to 1946. The thousands more identified through improved protocols in subsequent years. The millions of refugees assisted by UNHCR programs built on these principles. The countless soldiers who chose compassion over protocol because they'd been trained to think like Ror instead of just following orders. You can't quantify it exactly, but historians estimate that the policy changes and cultural shifts triggered by Ror's case have influenced the treatment of over 50 million civilians in conflict zones since 1945. 50 million people who were seen as humans instead of problems, who were protected instead of detained, who were given dignity instead of bureaucracy. All because one man brought a sewing machine to a tent. But the lesson here isn't really about military policy. It's bigger than that. It's about what happens when someone challenges a broken system. When someone says, I don't care what the regulations say, this is wrong, and I'm going to do what's right. Ror wasn't a general. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't someone with power or influence or connections. He was a sergeant, a mechanic, a guy from Kansas City who fixed cars before the war and wanted to fix cars after it. But in one moment, faced with one choice, he decided that human dignity mattered more than military protocol. And that choice echoed forward for 80 years. Here's what this tells us about innovation, about change, about courage. The best ideas don't always come from the top. They don't come from the experts or the officers or the people in charge. Sometimes they come from the guy in the garage. The mechanic who sees a sewing machine and thinks, that could help. The interpreter willing to translate difficult truths. The captain willing to back his sergeant even when headquarters is breathing down his neck. History is full of moments like this. Moments when someone without authority changed everything because they had something more important. They had humanity. In 1854, Florence Nightingale, a nurse, not a doctor, revolutionized military medicine by insisting that hygiene mattered more than heroic surgery. The military establishment mocked her, until mortality rates dropped by 60%. In 1940, a British shipping clerk named Geoffrey Pike proposed building aircraft carriers out of ice mixed with wood pulp. The Royal Navy called him insane, until they tested it and found it worked. Project Habakkuk didn't win the war, but it showed that crazy ideas deserve consideration. In 1968, a junior officer in the South Vietnamese Army suggested using psychological operations and community building instead of search and destroy missions in certain villages. His superiors called it weak. But the villages he worked with became some of the most stable areas in South Vietnam. The pattern is always the same. Someone low in the hierarchy sees a problem differently, proposes something unconventional, gets rejected or mocked, or told to shut up and follow orders. And then, if they're lucky, if they're persistent, if they find the right allies, they change everything. That's the real lesson of Bill Ror's story. Not that kindness is nice, but that courage looks like challenging the system when the system is wrong. Even when you're just a sergeant. Even when you have no authority. Even when doing the right thing might cost you everything. In business today, we call this disruptive innovation. In social movements, we call it grassroots change. But the principle is the same. Transformation starts with individuals who refuse to accept that "this is how we've always done it" is a good enough reason to keep doing wrong things. And here's the detail: almost nobody knows the final twist that brings this whole story full circle. In 1985, 40 years after that moment in Bavaria, Greta Wolf flew to Kansas City. She was 66 years old. White hair, deep lines around her eyes, but the same fierce determination Ror remembered. She showed up at his auto shop on a Tuesday morning in April, walked in while he was under a Chevrolet changing a transmission. His secretary told him, "There's a woman here to see you. Says her name is Greta." He rolled out from under the car, stood up, wiped the grease from his hands. And there she was. They talked for 3 hours. About the war. About what came after. About the lives they'd built from ashes. And before she left, Greta gave him something. A photograph. 23 women standing in front of a building in Zurich, 1945. All wearing white dresses made from parachute silk. All smiling. On the back, in neat handwriting, "We survived. Thank you for believing we could." But here's what Ror never knew, what Greta never told him during that visit. Those 23 women didn't just survive. They thrived. They became nurses, teachers, social workers, translators. They had families. They built careers. And they made a pact: every child born to one of them would learn the story. Would know about the sergeant who brought a sewing machine. Who chose kindness when cruelty was easier. By 1985, those 23 women had produced 47 children. By 2024, they have over 200 descendants living across 6 continents. Doctors, teachers, engineers, artists, activists. People who grew up hearing the story of how their grandmother survived because one man decided to see her as human. And here's the staggering part. 3 of those descendants work for the UNHCR today. 2 are military chaplains teaching humanitarian values to new soldiers. 1 is a documentary filmmaker who created a film about displaced persons in modern conflicts, dedicating it to my grandmother Greta and to Sergeant William Ror. The ripples keep spreading. The impact keeps compounding, not just through policy and protocol, but through lives and families and stories passed down. From one man, one choice, one sewing machine. Bill Ror died in January 1995. He was 78 years old. Heart attack. Quick and painless, the doctors said. His funeral was small. Family. A few customers from the shop. Some guys from the VFW who'd finally convinced him to join a few years earlier. But then something unexpected happened. The obituary ran in the Kansas City Star. It mentioned briefly his war service, his Bronze Star, the 23 women he'd helped save. And within a week, letters started arriving. From Poland, France, the Czech Republic, Canada, Australia. Letters from children and grandchildren of those 23 women. Letters saying, "Your father saved my grandmother. Your husband gave my mother her life back. Your grandfather showed my family what America really means." 127 letters in total. Susan Ror, Bill's daughter, read every one, and she understood something her father had never fully grasped, that his choice in April 1945 hadn't just saved 23 women. It had created 200 lives that wouldn't exist otherwise. It had shaped how millions of refugees would be treated for the next 80 years. It had proven that one person in one moment, armed with nothing but conscience and a sewing machine, could change the world. The last letter Susan received came from Warsaw, from a woman named Anna Wolf, Greta's niece. Anna wrote, "My Aunt Greta died in 1992. She lived 47 years after the war. Every single one of those years, she said, was a gift. A gift from a man who chose to see her as human when everyone else saw her as a problem. Tell your father's story. Make sure people know. Because the world needs to remember that heroes don't always wear medals. Sometimes they wear mechanics' overalls and carry wrenches, and choose kindness when killing would be easier." So here's what this story really means, what it's always meant from the first moment Bill Ror walked into that tent. It's not about World War II. It's not about 23 women. It's not even about one sergeant's choice. It's about the truth that courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's bringing a sewing machine to people who've lost everything. Sometimes it's choosing to see humans instead of problems, policies instead of bullets, trust instead of fear. From a Kansas City mechanic with a crazy idea about treating prisoners like people to policy reforms that protected 700 women immediately and influenced the treatment of 50 million refugees over 8 decades. From one sewing machine to 200 descendants who wouldn't exist without his choice. Bill Ror proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, that the bravest battles aren't always fought with weapons, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act in the world is simple human decency. Between 1945 and 2024, the principles he lived see people first build trust through actions, choose compassion over protocol, have shaped how every major humanitarian organization approaches refugees and displaced persons. That's the power of one choice, one moment. One person refusing to accept that this is how it's done, when how it's done is wrong. If you know stories like this, stories of ordinary people who changed the world through small acts of courage, share them in the comments. Because these are the stories that matter. Not just the generals and the battles and the grand strategies, but the mechanics and the medics and the interpreters who chose humanity when cruelty was easier. This is WWII Soldiers Archive. We tell the stories history forgot. The quiet heroes. The impossible choices. The moments that changed everything. Subscribe if you believe these stories deserve to be remembered. Because 80 years later, Bill Ror's choice is still echoing. Still rippling forward. Still proving that the most powerful weapon in any war isn't a gun or a bomb or a tank. It's the courage to see people as people. Even when everyone else has stopped looking.